Thank you very much. On behalf of United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, United States Army Pacific, United States Army Japan, our partners, the Australian Army, and certainly our friends and colleagues who have provided this magnificent facility, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. Thanks for coming, and let's get the show on the road here. Some admin to start off, please. Number one, how to work the headsets. You guys have probably figured it out already. If you speak English, you will probably not need this until we get into the two question and answer sessions, the first of which is after lunch. But push the power button in the middle. Don't worry about the buttons to the left, the up and down, because it's on station 1, which is where it should stay. And volume, obviously, you can press increase or decrease as you wish. And if you've already pressed the left-hand button, well, just flip through it until you find something. It's asked that when we do have the Q&A sessions that you keep the microphone fairly close to your mouth so that we can get it recorded. Eventually, these presentations today and both days to follow will be posted in English on APAN, probably a couple, 3 weeks afterwards, and we will also provide a Japanese language copy to the GSO, the headquarters here for the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. So it will be available to you. The only exception in that regard will be the sessions in the morning of Thursday, the 18th of July, because the topic there dealing with the security of major urban areas during world-class events is thought to be a bit sensitive. And so we will cover that to some extent in the written proceedings that will come out, but it will not be posted online for general access. Bit more admin before I get to what's up there on the screen. When you throw your garbage away in the restrooms, please, paper towels are fine. Paper in general is fine. But if you have Starbucks cups, if you've got plastic bottles or whatever, the soldiers have to separate that out if we don't take it and dispose of it otherwise. So carry that with you if you would be so kind, and put it in a recycling bin someplace, or find another trash bin after you leave Ichigawa, which is the facility that we're now on. And lastly, if you've not checked in with the ladies to the back left from my perspective, back right from your perspective at the desk there, then please do so, that we have accountability for everybody who's here for security and other purposes. All right, let's go through the rest of the admin, and then we'll get into the meat of our discussion this morning. As far as emergency evacuation, essentially there are 2 stairwells from this floor. If you go out this door, there are none in that hallway. So go out, take the first right, hit the wall where the latrines are, and you can either go right and by the registration table that you saw where our Japanese partners were registering. There's a door right there. There's another one if you turn left and go down right before the second hallway that you can turn left there. Obviously, if you exit out of the 2 exits to the rear, you will turn left, go down the steps, turn left again, and the emergency exit is either that door that is straight ahead of you, or again, you can turn right and move down the hallway until you find the other one on the left. Now, they should both exit at the ground floor and find your way outside. There is as you exit the building, and all the badges should not be a concern at that point. Everything should be open. You walk out of the building. If you walk to your 10 o'clock, if you will, there's an open athletic field there, and that's where we would ask that you all gather. Hopefully we won't have to worry about that, but obviously good to know. The restrooms are, as I already described, essentially to your right rear, just down the hallway from where you registered. All meals, coffee, etc. are no host. We will have individuals that will guide you over that way. All of our Japanese colleagues that have a purple armband, and certainly myself and the other ladies and gentlemen up in the front, or the officers and individuals to the left rear for you who are note takers can guide you any place in this building on this floor, but also tell you where the restaurants are and where the Starbucks coffee is, which also has a auto teller machine, and we will go there for lunch collectively. Again, it's no host, so everybody can purchase their own lunch or coffee. You have your speaker packets. If there are any questions that are not addressed therein, please don't hesitate to get a hold of any one of us from that group or groups that I just mentioned. Unfortunately, Colonel Scott, who has been absolutely magnificent as U.S. Army Pacific's liaison officer to the headquarters here for the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force, was pulled away on a family emergency, so he will not be here all week. But Colonel Kent Justice, you here, Kent? Okay, he was here earlier. Myself, Mr. Christopher, back here in the left rear to you. And as I said, any microphone holder, Mark Kreuzer, who's just there, and any microphone holder, or again, our Japanese partners with the armbands can assist you with issues, questions, whatever the case might be. There is no assigned seating other than for those of you that are in the front row now and speakers on the day. Now, we held a conference similar to this in New York City in April of 2018. What we did there was we encouraged individuals not to sit with people that they were comfortable with. So we encourage you, Australian, Singapore, US, Korean, Japanese, that please find somebody that you are not friends with or familiar with yet, and look to sit with them at lunch, look to sit with them during the rest of the conference, because we found that we have a very good exchange of ideas. We stimulate fresh thinking, and so do feel free. In fact, please ensure that you break away from your comfort zone. Okay, next slide, thank you. If you don't return your badge at the end of the day, you will be hunted down and dragged back. Or actually, just please make sure that you do. If you leave early, then where you checked in, just drop your badge off with one of the ladies there, or in the case of our Japanese colleagues, obviously, the desks where you registered. At the end of the conference, however, just take your badge, it'll help you get out of the building, and at the first floor, there will be somebody there to collect it. But we do need to turn them in every day, and then they'll be reissued the following days. There should be no food or drinks in the auditorium unless it's a drink that has a sealed cap. So a bottle of water, Starbucks, if you buy it and it does have a lid on it, then no problem, but please no open containers. And lastly, we are trying to capture all of this for recording, as I said. It also helps us write the proceedings after the event. And I will ensure that all of you who are on the attendee roster get the proceedings, which will probably be a couple, 3 months afterwards, and they will be translated into Japanese as well. But do wait if you have a question. During the question and answer period, I will identify the person who will ask the question, but wait for that microphone so that they can capture your question. The translators can translate it, and that way both individuals who don't speak the language of the question and also obviously those who are recording can get your questions so that we have coherency throughout. Next slide, thank you. So what are our objectives? You can see them on the slide. Number one, the focus here, although we have tactical examples that will come to the fore to demonstrate points, is the operational and strategic levels, not the tactical level. We want to make sure that when we walk away from this event that we have a firmer grasp of how we can better secure the world's largest urban areas for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And that is across the full spectrum of possible conflict. So everything from a major natural disaster to, hopefully not, a significant combat event in a megacity someplace around the world. There's much commonality in these various contingencies, and we want to capture that as we move on. Hidden in all that, if you will, not so specifically hidden, is that we are looking at trying to bring to bear the full range of capabilities. This is not just a matter of military working with military. It's not just a matter of government entities working together, but we also want to determine how we can better coordinate the capabilities of those entities with non-governmental organizations or NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, faith-based organizations, or even commercial and industrial organizations in addition. Next slide, thank you. Definitions here for strategic level of warfare and operational level of warfare, I think, are probably commonly understood, but just in case not, they are laid out here in the slide. Next slide, thank you. All right, I already addressed the first point, but I want to re-encourage you again. The reason that we don't have specific seating assignments for everybody is because we do hope that you will mix it up and speak to individuals, whether they are from your organization and you don't know them, or whether they are from overseas someplace, or whether they're Japanese and you're from overseas. Let's go ahead and mix it up so that we can exchange fresh ideas amongst ourselves. At the top of the agenda, you will find my email. And I would stomp my foot or wave a handkerchief is what we say in English in the United States. Getting your insights, you audience members' insights, so that we can capture them in the written proceedings is absolutely essential. Some of the best points that came out of the New York event were observations made by members of the audience. And by that I mean, if you disagree with something that a speaker says and you have a better approach to it, if you have a personal experience that helps to reinforce a point, or if you have a recommendation in how perhaps we can address changes to or modifications to our doctrines, to our policies, whatever, please send me an email so that we can capture that for the proceedings. You can do that as the conference is progressing. We don't have internet here, but say this evening, but also any time up to 2 or 3 weeks after the conference is over, send me that email and propose your idea. You may think it's crazy. I will probably think it's a grand idea. As said, this is the second of 2 events. The first was held in New York. The second is held here in Tokyo for reasons that we will talk about later today. There's the possibility of a third in a developing world megacity in 2020. And I want to emphasize that. Although we are focusing on Tokyo today, and although much of the commentary will focus on Tokyo tomorrow and the next day, we should constantly realize that our armies may be assisting other nations and other megacities in both developed and developing world megacities. So don't consider your remarks, don't consider our remarks only in the context of Tokyo. We want to generalize and be able to apply our observations from this 3 days to any megacity, any major urban area around the world. Next slide, thank you. What we are trying to do in part is to define, to better understand the operational environment that is the megacity, the world's largest, most interconnected, and most influential urban areas in the world. Next slide, thank you. And to conclude the administrative remarks before getting into the meat of our discussion today, obviously the comments that are made here in some instances, and I will identify, for example, my definition of megacities is not doctrinal, it is not policy, but I will put it out there as a point of discussion. So, views that are expressed may not, in some cases, represent official views of the U.S. Department of Defense or, very likely, other speakers' organizations. To not put too fine a point on it, when we have question and answer time, please keep your questions short, and if possible, keep them such that they are one part. We have the simultaneous translation. It's all the more difficult if you have 2 or 3 questions asked simultaneously. And I know this would not happen amongst this group, but there have been conferences that I've been involved in where the question and answer period was taken as an opportunity to present personal views. What we're here to do is obviously exchange good ideas, to draw on the experts that happen to be on the podium today, tomorrow, and the next day. So if you have personal agendas, that's not the time to express them, but you can certainly express them amongst your colleagues here in the room. And the other 2 bullets are simply reminders of points that I have already hit here. Good. Let's move on then to the first briefing. So the laydown for today. I'm the master of ceremonies, if you will, but the true pith of what we're going to be talking about will come from my 3 colleagues who are on the stage here, representatives from the United States Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, headquartered at Fort Meade, Maryland, in the United States. Major Caleb Dexter is actually stationed in New York City at Fort Hamilton. The other 2 members of the AWG, Asymmetric Warfare Group, Captain Jesse Geyer and Captain Jeniel Moncrief, are there at Fort Meade. You can see the laydown of what we are going to do. Essentially, I will do a brief introduction. I will turn it over in order to Major Dexter, Captain Geyer, Captain Moncrief. They will go through the morning early session, basically describing Tokyo in terms that I will discuss here momentarily. We will then break for lunch. We will come back and have a question and answer period should any questions have arisen from the morning session. We will then in the afternoon relook the situation in Tokyo with a notional 7.3 earthquake during the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. And that should help set the stage for the next couple of days. We have an outstanding group of presenters coming tomorrow and the next day, and they will be covering events such as the 1995 Shinriko nerve agent attack on the Tokyo subway. Dr. Tetsuo Akamura will address that, who's written some fantastic articles on it. And he was a doctor at St. Luke's, the hospital that had the most casualties during that event. We will have discussions of the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi disaster that followed the earthquake and tsunami in north of Tokyo, and other events as well. So much of what you hear today is setting the stage for those ladies and gentlemen that will follow. So we'll have that question and answer session. We'll then go into that notional disaster discussion of Tokyo, and then we'll have another question and answer session before wrapping up around 1600, 4 p.m. Next slide, thank you. So let's start basically. What is an urban area? Seems like a simple question, but the truth of the matter is you can see how various countries define it in terms of raw numbers. It can be anything from a cluster of buildings and personnel with a population up to 200 or more, or I should say 200 or more, or you can see on the extreme, it could be 50,000 or more. So we do not have a specific worldwide definition. And the United Nations, for example, does not have a single definition, but rather they adopt what the country that they are discussing uses for a definition of urban areas. So as you get more into this topic, and as you hear the discussion, what is understood to be an urban area can be very, very different depending upon who it is you're speaking to or what group is representing a particular country. Now, our interest is in a operationally valuable definition. So the definition that we will use for this conference, at least for this day 1, is an urban area is, and I quote, a continuously built up mass of urban development which is best thought of as an urban footprint. And if you conceive of it, it is the lighted area at night that a picture from an aircraft or a satellite would show. So looking down from a satellite, it is the illuminated, continuous illuminated area. That would be a single urban area. It's not as precise as some might like the definition, but it certainly is operationally one that we can all grasp. Next slide, thank you. And as I said, I would propose a definition for megacity that hopefully also extends beyond the common understanding right now, which is simply an urban area of over 10 million people. Not too long ago, a megacity was considered any urban area of over 1 million. It then became 8 million. It then became 9 million. It is currently 10 million. And chances are good because we are increasing these largest urban areas in the world daily, both in terms of the populations of those that already have 10 million, but also in the number of cities that join that group, which we will talk about a bit more tomorrow. It doesn't really help us from the operational perspective to say that a certain break point designates a megacity. There's not that much difference between a city of 8 million or 12 million in terms of population and geographic spread in a lot of cases. There's a huge difference between a city of 10 or 11 million and the largest megacities in the world, Tokyo with some 38 plus million now, Jakarta in second place with over 30 million. But in truth, while population size and density and geographic spread are significant operationally, there are other elements that are likewise absolutely critical. And we can see in the definition in red, those include complexity, interconnectedness, and influence. By interconnectedness, I mean every urban area is linked, say, to the rural area in its immediate environs. A megacity, however, is going to have certainly nationwide impact, likely super-regional impact, in other words, both its nation and others in the immediate vicinity, and in many cases, worldwide impact. Now, because we don't tie this definition to 10 million, I would offer that there are cities of over 10 million that don't qualify under this definition as a megacity. China has 6 cities or urban areas of over 10 million. Some of those do not have the interconnectedness nor the influence super-regionally or worldwide that would qualify for this definition. On the other hand, there are cities that may be far less in terms of population, beneath 10 million, but do have that connectedness and that influence. And I use the example of Singapore. Singapore, the city and country itself, but also those urban areas that could be considered a portion of it, separated simply by some narrow bodies of water that are in Malaysia and Indonesia, have a population of roughly 6 million. And yet, if you look at the characteristics of Singapore, you can see that it is absolutely vital, not only in terms of economics, which many of us may first think of Singapore in terms of, but also in transportation, in particular shipping. If, God forbid, there was a major disaster in Singapore of some type, obviously the reverberations around the world economically, security-wise, would be tremendous. And so therefore, while perhaps some megacities, or I should say some population urban areas of over 10 million may not qualify with this definition, other cities, with our exemplar being Singapore, would. Next slide, please. Now, let's use Tokyo as our example. That's where we are, after all. I'm not going to go through all of these bullets, but it gives us some idea of that interconnectedness. It gives us some idea of just how influential Tokyo is as the world's largest megacity, and it's representative of other megacities around this planet of ours. I've already stated it has a population of 38 million plus, making it the largest urban area in the world in terms of population. You can see the impact in that second bullet of just how much GDP, over 1/3 of this country's already an economic giant, GDP comes from the capital of Tokyo. And on that slide to the right, you could see that if Tokyo was a standalone government or country, it would have the 17th largest GDP in the world, far more than a majority of the countries in the rest of the world. And I'll let you look at the other bullets, but I want to bring your attention to that at the bottom. Again, from the operational perspective, when you're looking at a megacity, you're not looking at a single administrative entity. There is no one single government authority that is the megacity of Tokyo. Just as in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles has a population of, say, roughly 6 million or so. The megacity of Los Angeles has a population of some 14 million, but when you look at how many authorities there are, they include the city of Los Angeles, Burbank, Santa Monica, Pacific Palisades, Long Beach, and many, many others. So if you go into an area assisting with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, you are going to have to be dealing with these very many different authorities, which often do not have a single emergency operations center or a single administrator or even group of administrators that can speak for all of them. And as a quick tactical aside, to violate my own guidance that we're focusing on the operational strategic, in the 1992 Los Angeles riots, U.S. Army forces moved into Los Angeles and did what U.S. Army units do, and any ground force does. They drew their boundaries based on rivers, on streets, on turnpikes. By so doing, it made sense as far as their soldiers knowing where their limits were physically, but they ended up multiplying several times over the number of authorities that they had to then liaison with. If they instead had drawn their boundaries according to administrative boundaries, the various cities, they would have greatly reduced the burden on themselves in terms of manpower and equipment to coordinate their efforts with those of local authorities. I'd like to say that we learned that lesson, but we did exactly the same thing in 2003, 2004 Iraq before adjusting. And I am confident that the United States Army is not the only one that has made that error in the past. But we need to be advised, we need to be aware of the fact that megacities often have not only tens, but hundreds of authorities within that area that's illuminated from a satellite at night. Next slide, thank you. A second example, and I don't even try to pronounce what is the megacity of Jakarta's name now, which combines the first letters of several cities that are part of Jakarta, but you can see there on the left-hand side, the blue or the green shows you how much Jakarta has expanded in less than a 30-year period. Again, it is the second largest urban population in the world, and you can see at the bottom, we think of Australia, and Australia is a major country, a major player in the international scene, and yet one city in that particular case has a population well more than Australia. I put that up there to emphasize just how great the challenges are going to be when you go into an urban area of this size. Next slide, thank you. Again, our second session will focus on a 7.3 earthquake in Tokyo during the 2020 Summer Olympics. Now, why do we focus on HADR, you might ask? Why are we focused on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief? Well, as a commander of the United States Army Pacific Command said several years ago, this region in particular is vulnerable to natural disasters, as we might well know. 57% of the deaths that occurred between 1970 and 2014, as said, were in the Asia-Pacific region. So we are militaries that not only need to be prepared to deal with disasters in our own megacities, but also to be ready to send capabilities to assist other countries and other megacities in the Asia-Pacific and really Indo-Pacific region. Next slide, thank you. A couple of examples, returning to Tokyo. In 1923, Tokyo suffered its last major earthquake in terms of the scope of disaster. You can see what the statistics are there. Over 140,000 of the city's residents were killed, primarily due to fires. There have been a great number of adjustments made there in terms of structure and in terms of other preparation. And I will state up front, and I will repeat this, Tokyo is probably, and I would say undoubtedly, the urban area in the world, certainly the megacity in the world, that is best prepared for disasters. That is reflected to some extent. You see the second earthquake that I highlight there in 1995, different scale, different location in the epicenter, but still no deaths and a 6.2 Richter scale. Now, we'd like to say that all of Japan and all of megacities, if they said, put into effect policies that adopted what Tokyo would do, that we were therefore safe from future disasters, we know that's not the case, because in 1995, Osaka had several thousand people that were killed in another earthquake. No city is invulnerable. Developing world, developed world, it makes no difference, to a major disaster. And thus, again, why we are focusing on HADR over this 3 days. And of course, it's not just natural disasters. We have to be concerned with man-made disasters, whether it is combat or whether it is, more likely, terrorism. We've already mentioned that we will discuss those two that are at the bottom of the page. And these are not the only disasters. We might think that they can be limited to natural and man-made. Next slide, please. But certainly our Japanese colleagues realize, as in 1953, again in 1957, and finally in 1968, when they had to cancel an afternoon's worth of classes at Tokyo University, you need to be prepared for other types as well. And there is no force in the world better able to deal with Godzilla than the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. So there are lessons to be learned from our partners there as well. Next slide, thank you. So how are we going to lay out then this morning? Every city has flows of people, flows of power, flows of money. How do you decide to go about trying to describe the megacity of Tokyo in a matter of some 4 hours or 5 hours? Well, what we have chosen to do is to look at those flows. We will look at flows into the megacity, within the megacity, and out of the megacity. And from left to right across the front stage here, it will be Caleb, Jesse, and Jeniel that will describe those as they are listed. In each of those 3 cases, they will look at the flows as shown in red: water, power, expertise, and labor, the human element, if you will, goods and services, or supplies and services, and waste. We will do that both in the session that begins immediately upon the cessation of my remarks here, and again when we look at that notional 7.3 earthquake occurring next summer. Understanding an urban area to the extent that we can before we ever go into it helps us a great deal to establish a base understanding that is of operational value. The British have a very effective saying when dealing with Northern Ireland, one that has existed now since at least the 1960s. By understanding a city, not only with your preliminary research, but when your soldiers go out and come back and report on their various reconnaissances, on their various patrols, they get better and better at understanding what they say is the absence of the normal or the presence of the abnormal. And by that, for example, I might mean that if Mr. Smith is selling Coke on the corner of 4th and Main Street every day, and all of a sudden he doesn't show up, your soldiers should understand, your Marines should ask why that's the case. Is it because there is a terrorist that's setting an ambush down the street? Is it because maybe there's an IED that's been put up? Or is it because it happens to be a holiday, and so therefore that gentleman decided to stay home? Those are the sorts of levels of understanding that we want. That level of understanding starts with what we are trying to present to you today. But of course, we're only starting to put our toe in the water. There is obviously hours and days and years that need to be used to study any megacity. Next slide, thank you. So, again, trying to show you somewhat like I did in terms of the megacity of Jakarta, you can see how much Tokyo has expanded in approximately 60 years. Next slide, thank you. What are some of the objectives that we hope to cover starting today and the next 2 days? Number one, as already alluded to, we need to consider our ability, our preparations in getting ready for HAR disasters in terms of more than just military or more than just whole of government, first of all. Secondly, it's not just a matter of recognizing that, it's a matter of having substantive representation when we do our planning, when we do our exercises. And that doesn't mean one member of the Red Cross to identify or to represent all NGOs. It means having individuals who are active participants from A to Z in those planning processes, during those exercises, and then, of course, in execution itself. And finally, we need to constantly realize that any megacity, any urban area, is both a system in and of itself. Tokyo is a system that comprises commercial, governmental, fire, police, all sorts of subsystems, infrastructure. But it also is part of a larger system, tied in with its local rural environment, as Caleb will identify almost immediately, but also Tokyo is tied into a worldwide system, economically and otherwise. I like to use the metaphor of a pool table. Think of a rural area as one that has 2 or 3 numbered balls on the table and the one cue ball, and when I, Russ Glenn, strike the cue ball, chances are pretty good I will miss all of those numbered balls. But even if I do happen to hit 1 or 2, the consequences, the effects of that are pretty easy to calculate. Now let's say that 1 million people in an urban area is represented by a rack of cue balls, or excuse me, of numbered balls. So Tokyo would have 38 plus racks of numbered balls on the table. Now when I strike that cue ball, you can be guaranteed I'm going to hit something, but trying to determine the second and the third and the higher order effects is virtually impossible. And yet we need to do everything that we can, not only in terms of when we're dealing with megacities within that system that is a megacity, but also nationally, super regionally, and worldwide. Next slide, thank you. Okay, I would now like to introduce Major Caleb Dexter, and Caleb is going to, as stated, look at inflows into the megacity of Tokyo in terms of water, power, human elements, goods and services, and outflows.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn. Before I begin my presentation, there's a brief video I would like to show that was produced by my organization, the Asymmetric Warfare Group. And here it is.
Army forces operating in complex, densely populated urban terrain in dense urban areas is the toughest and bloodiest form of combat, and it will become the norm, not the exception in the future. General Mark Milley, Army Chief of Staff. The world's population is growing at an unprecedented rate, and trends in migration show that around 60% of people will live in urban areas by the year 2030. The United Nations predicts we will see over 40 megacities, which are defined as cities with more than 10 million residents, by 2030. In addition to megacities, pockets of dense urban terrain can be found in most urban areas. Dense urban terrain is characterized by extraordinary, closely packed man-made infrastructure, both social and physical interconnectedness, and high population density. This includes concentrations of high-rise buildings, often with subterranean features, and densely packed slum concentrations. Dense urban terrain presents a litany of challenges our military has never faced. The uncontrolled urban sprawl makes it difficult to plan and execute operations, while minimizing civilian casualties and the displacement of the local population. Operations are made more complex by the radical geometry of dense urban terrain. Forces must be able to quickly and decisively move from the extremes of a skyscraper to a subterranean structure. These three-dimensional spaces in urban environments will provide additional opportunities for maneuver, but they present a departure from the horizontal target engagement that Army maneuver forces are accustomed. Subterranean environments present their own unique challenges to Army operations, especially regarding maneuver, fires, protection, and intelligence. Impenetrable traffic congestion can make quick navigation of the city by our forces nearly impossible. Our adversaries are no longer easily identifiable, especially when they live and operate within the civilian population. Conventional forces and paramilitary organizations both operate within these dense urban terrains. And the high concentration of civilians in confined areas allows terrorists to inflict massive casualties and chaos. The rise of criminal networks and black markets only adds to this sense of chaos and discontent within the population. Social, political, religious, and cultural dynamics can result in uprisings and deadly violence and force our military into security assistance missions. A high level of connectedness is a key component of dense urban terrain. Cities exhibit both external and internal connectedness. External connectedness via the internet leads to global visibility and awareness of events, which makes isolating dense urban terrain impossible. Internal connectedness arises from the relationships that connect population, terrain, and infrastructure, defining the structure and behavior of the city. The exponential rise of technology and the high connectedness of dense urban terrain has led to a new domain in which our adversaries can operate. Cyber networks allow for the instantaneous exchange of information and delivery of effects to people, organizations, and infrastructure. These digital attacks have the potential to impact critical U.S. communications and infrastructure. They can influence the population and degrade military operations. The U.S. Army and its joint partners must be prepared to operate in dense urban terrain and continue to improve our capabilities. It's not a question of if, but when. Humanitarian assistance and disaster relief are equally critical for the Army and the Joint Force. Relief missions for disasters such as Hurricanes Katrina, Harvey, and Irma, as well as the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor leak, show the importance of our forces being adequately prepared to operate, given any contingency, within dense urban areas. These natural disasters can result in billions of dollars in damage, and the relief efforts often require tens of thousands of troops. These massive cities present logistical challenges that are amplified when natural disasters destroy existing infrastructure and cut off supplies to the population. Crime has the potential to skyrocket as citizens fight for dwindling resources. And as populations grow and migrate to dense urban areas, the level of devastation from natural disasters, such as floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, and droughts, will only increase dramatically. Dense urban terrain conflicts are nothing new, but the challenges are growing more complex every day. As our adversaries continue to evolve and threaten to neutralize our strengths, we must adapt our own strategies, technologies, and training to stay ahead of the fight. U.S. forces must be trained to operate and win in this quagmire of congested roadways, overflowing slums, and mazes of subterranean infrastructures, all the while minimizing civilian casualties. Think, adapt, anticipate. The Asymmetric Warfare Group.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. As Dr. Glenn mentioned, my name is Caleb Dexter. I am a major working for the Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Dense Urban Terrain Detachment, which is in the U.S. Army's only base in New York City, Fort Hamilton. And that terrain of New York City happens to be the U.S.'s densest urban terrain in the borough of Manhattan. And sometimes in the borough of Manhattan, we conduct terrain walks for members of the U.S. military, and we thought we would do something similar here, but here in Tokyo, the audience is too large to conduct an actual boots-on-the-ground terrain walk outdoors. Therefore, I and my Asymmetric Warfare Group colleagues would like to conduct a virtual terrain walk with you. We hope to highlight some of the aspects of dense urban terrain that differentiate it from other forms of terrain. Specifically, in the case of a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario, like the hypothetical one that Dr. Glenn indicated just a moment ago. Next slide. As Dr. Glenn said, we approach understanding the complexities of a megacity by breaking down the flows that are needed to sustain that city into three directional flows. Flows into the city, flows within the city, and flows out of the city. I'll be covering flows into the city. My colleague, Captain Jesse Geyer, will be covering flows within the city. And following that, my colleague, Captain Jenny Moncrief, will cover flows out of the city. For right now, though, I'd like to return to Dr. Glenn's introduction, where he touched on some aspects of flow. Specifically, we're going to go into a bit more detail on the 5 inputs into the megacity and into dense urban terrain that are part of the flow that Dr. Glenn mentioned. You might recall that he mentioned 5 critical flows into, within, and out of dense urban terrain. To paraphrase Dr. Glenn, these are, next, power, water, people, supplies, and waste. I'm going to address each in turn and go into a bit more detail on how these flows, which are usually not part of our military planning process, can have a big effect on military operations in a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario. Next slide, please. I should note at this point that this flow analysis is not that dissimilar to the analytical approaches that other institutions have employed in the past, such as the IBM Center for Economic Development, next, 6-factor model, where the 6 flows they identified are energy, water, people, communication, business, and transport. Next slide, please. Before we begin to examine the inputs that flow into the megacity, let's first examine an absolutely vital distinction that is often misunderstood both within the military and within wider society. And that is the distinction between, next, a stock and a, next, flow. A stock is a quantity of something, anything, at a specific and singular point in time. A flow, on the other hand, is a quantity of something over a specific interval of time. An intuitive example of this is that of a reservoir. A reservoir has, at any given point in time, a stock of water that it holds. It also has 2 flows. The flow of water into the reservoir at a specific point in time, over a specific interval of time, and the flow of water out of the reservoir over that same specific interval of time. Next slide, please. The stock versus flow concept is widely used in economics and finance, where capital stocks and flows are monitored closely by governments, banks, and investors alike, and has an academic pedigree dating back many decades. Next slide, please. It's a useful concept for us in the military, too, especially as it relates to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This distinction between stocks and flows is even more important for operations in dense urban terrain than in other sorts of terrain, because dense urban terrain, next, has less of a stock of necessary resources to fall back on in the event of a disaster, meaning that the maintenance of or failing that quick restoration of necessary flows is all the more important. For example, in my own town of New York City, food distributors have, on average, only between a 4 and 5 day stock of food supplies on hand on any given day. Those stocks can be drawn down quickly in the event of a natural disaster, as can be seen here immediately before Hurricane Sandy struck New York City. Unlike the inhabitants of more rural areas, most city dwellers do not have the option of harvesting crops or livestock to compensate for any disruptions in the flow of foodstuffs. Nor is it just food that is held in short supply. Most cities have limited stocks of other necessities like fuel, water, medicine, and so forth, and therefore rely heavily on the unrestricted flows of vital resources. Next slide, please. These flows move into the city through a variety of means: water pipes, electrical lines, highways, ports, and so on. Next slide. Let's take the electricity flowing into the city as an example. First, it's important to know where the city that powers this, where the electricity that powers the city comes from. Next. How much of the city's energy comes from the city's highest generating power plant? Its second highest, its third. In other words, how diversified, next, is the city's power supply? Here, we see how much of Tokyo's power comes from each of the plants of over 1,500 megawatts of capacity that supply the city. What kind of fuel do those power plants use? That we can see here on the graph on the left. How much of that fuel is on hand in inventory? In other words, what is the stock of fuel on hand, and how quickly will it be used up based on average consumption rates, or, in other words, based on the flow of power? We should note that these sources of electricity might not, indeed, are probably not, in our area of operations. Next slide, please. Here, we see the closest power plant with a capacity of greater than 1,500 megawatts to where we now sit in the GSO building, the TEPCO Kawasaki Thermal Power Station in neighboring Kawasaki. 23 kilometers separate the two locations from each other. Could they be in the same AO? Maybe for a division, probably not for a brigade. Yet, the electricity provided by this power plant is absolutely vital to the well-being of the individuals in the area where we find ourselves now. Without it, water could not be pumped to the upper stories of buildings. Commuter trains couldn't carry any passengers. Foodstuffs couldn't be unloaded from, nor could recyclables bound for overseas be loaded into, cargo ships in port, and so forth. Each of these cases will be explored in greater detail later in our presentation. Next slide, please. One interesting fact about Japan is that unlike most power grids in the developed world, Japan is the only advanced nation where the power grid is split into two different frequencies of 50 hertz in the east and 60 hertz in the west, and they are not compatible. Use of high voltage electrical power from one grid to another requires frequency converter stations. The dividing line between grids is not too far to the west of Tokyo. When a large power generation source is taken offline due to some kind of disaster in one grid, excess power from the west, for example, can't be diverted to the east in an efficient and effective manner to make up for the loss of the other power grid. The Japanese are familiar with this since Tokyo experienced rolling power outages and brownouts in the wake of the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011 and subsequent Fukushima nuclear disaster. Since then, there has been significant improvement to the conversion throughput, more than doubling it, and it is projected to triple by 2030. This power grid difference in Tokyo allows us to highlight a power resource planning consideration that is typically not a factor in a developed, modern megacity. How does this power grid difference affect wide area disaster relief response efforts? Not all megacities are developed like New York City, Tokyo, or Paris. How will the reliability of the electrical power grid be different in underdeveloped megacities? If not careful, utilizing local power sources with foreign equipment can cause failures that hinder humanitarian assistance disaster relief efforts. It's a small, nuanced bit of information that could nevertheless have significant implications if not accounted for properly. Additionally, how will power that has been interrupted in areas affect relief operations? Are you tied into the power management plan for the city to know when rolling brownouts will occur so that operations are minimally impacted? How will water or transit be affected by these power issues? Keep these in mind for our discussion this afternoon and for the remainder of the conference. Next slide, please. Next on our list of critical flows is water. If we thought that the distance between where we are at the GSO headquarters and the source of electricity was long, it doesn't even really compare to the distance between our current location and one of Tokyo's closest major reservoirs, next, Lake Okutama, next, behind the Ogauchi Dam, next, some 62 kilometers and multiple natural boundaries away. Would that be likely to be in the same area of operations? Most likely not. Next slide, please. Yet each of the 9.3 million individuals within the 23 special wards of Tokyo, which is to say just a subset of the overall population of the megacity of Tokyo, need, at the barest minimum, next, according to the World Health Organization, next, 2.5 liters per day of water just to survive. That does not include water for bathing or personal hygiene, just for drinking and eating. That's over 23.3 million liters of water needed each and every day without interruption, just for the population to survive in the very near term. Next slide, please. Similar to how we examined where the megacity gets electricity from, military planners would be well served to analyze where the water piped into their AO comes from a single source? If not, how many sources? What are their effective storage capacities, their stock of water, if known? Tokyo is fortunate to be within a compact and highly productive watershed, as can be seen here. Next slide, please. This allows the city to have a highly diversified network of water sources, as can be seen in this graph of the city's various reservoirs, dams, and locks. The city's residents are indeed fortunate to have a system of waterworks with such a high degree of redundancy. Next slide, please. In the event of a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario, however, the task of providing security, or at least augmenting pre-existing security for that water supply, could potentially fall on the military. This is something we'll talk about in greater detail in the afternoon session. But for now, I just wanted to show you our sped-up virtual terrain flight of the Tama River as it makes its way from Lake Okutama to the Ozaku intake weir near the U.S. Air Force's Yokota Air Base, where the water begins the process of being converted into potable water. The river, which only provides about 20% of Tokyo's water supply, travels over 22 kilometers between its origin and the site of its treatment for further distribution within Tokyo's 23 special wards. And those 22 kilometers wind their way through terrain that ranges from sharply peaked mountains to dense urban terrain cluttered with densely packed multi-story buildings, railroad tracks, and roadways. And we haven't even reached downtown Tokyo yet. This virtual terrain flight is just to allow for a shared understanding of the terrain as we take up security considerations in the afternoon session. Next slide, please. A point to consider in the afternoon session is the video displayed only one of the rivers from which Tokyo draws its water. There is also an entirely separate and more complex water purification project using the waters of the Ara and Tone river systems to provide potable water to the residents of Tokyo. Next slide, please. Third on our list, you might recall, is people. Just as electricity and water flow into the city to be consumed by its populace, so too do people, in that their labor is consumed in the act of them producing goods and providing services. Nor is this number of people who flow into the metropolis of Tokyo insignificant. In fact, each day, the population of Tokyo swells by more than 2.4 million due to commuters arriving from outside the metropolis's borders, more than the entire population of the municipality of Paris. Nor are such daily swings in daytime populations of megacities uncommon, with New York City seeing a smaller but still significant increase of over 400,000 people on any given weekday. Maintaining this flow is important to us civil and military planners for two reasons. One, allowing residents of outlying areas to access their workplaces is vital for those residents' financial well-being, which in turn is important for minimizing potential civil disruptions. And two, a good portion of those people who flow into the city every morning are highly skilled, essential personnel that allow for the other facets of flow to run smoothly. A good example of this type of person would be the medical doctor commuting from his affluent suburban neighborhood to the centrally located hospital where he works. Next slide, please. For example, in my own town of New York City, over 40% of police officers do not live within the city, meaning the police department could see its numbers cut almost in half if a disaster of some kind precluded officers from reaching their duty locations. And police are just one category of essential personnel that are necessary for the proper functioning of a city. Other professionals with other forms of expertise might similarly be disproportionately found living outside the city's borders. Without the flow of such individuals into the city, military operations in a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario might be, indeed is likely to be, hampered, perhaps considerably so. As with the other facets of flow above, it is probably worthwhile for civil and military planners to consider the distribution of key personnel within the megacity. That way, they can prepare their formations for any potential disruptions in other facets of flow if the people flow is curtailed or diminished in some way. Next slide, please. And the flow that brings that expertise into the megacity is quite often the public transportation system. Here, our virtual terrain walk is more of a virtual terrain ride as we watch Japan's most heavily used train line, with over 1.6 million riders daily, the Tokyo Metro Tozai line, travel from its point of origin, Nishi Funabashi Station in neighboring Chiba Prefecture, to Iidabashi Station, about 2 kilometers away from where we sit in the GSO building right now. Though the terrain is not as varied as it was in the case of the Tama River as it flowed from the Ogochi Dam, nevertheless, I think the breadth of this vital transportation corridor gives pause, I think, to almost any civil or military planner contemplating the security considerations of safeguarding such a flow conduit. This, again, is something we'll discuss in the afternoon session. Indeed, given the 2.4 million commuter figure recently mentioned, almost a fifth of the population of the metropolis of Tokyo, which should not be confused with the far larger population of the megacity of Tokyo, flows into the metropolis each and every weekday morning. Next slide, please. Again, it should be pointed out that the Tokyo Metro Tozai line is but one of 13 different rail lines that make up the Tokyo Metro subway system. Just as with our earlier 2 examples of electricity and water, it would be advantageous for civil and military planners to analyze the flow of trains or buses or barges, or whatever the case may be for the megacity being analyzed, into the megacity to factor into their planning considerations. Next slide, please. Fourth on our list is supplies. In the event of a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario, supplies are likely to be scarce due to spoilage, destruction, and the like, and to be needed very urgently. In this kind of scenario, it's imperative for civil and military planners to know how supplies flow into the megacity under normal circumstances. For example, through the city's port, so that they can assess whether the same locations and methods can be used in a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario. Next slide, please. Here we see the Port of Tokyo, part of the combined Tokyo, Kawasaki, Yokohama, Keijin port system, and, under normal circumstances, the 20th busiest port in the world with 7.6 million containers, or TEUs, short for 20-foot equivalent units, handled every year. In the specific case of Tokyo, this is a major point of entry for 2 extremely important supplies, fuel and food. Indeed, roughly 2/3 of Japan's food, as measured in calories, and almost 9/10 of its fossil fuels are imported from abroad. And nearly all of that food, next, nearly all of that food arrives to Japan at one of 5 points. Next, the port of Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Next. As can be seen in this video, these supplies are then further distributed to the rest of the city and beyond. Given the preponderance of megacities that lie on oceans or major rivers, ports and their accompanying infrastructure are likely to play a substantial role in the inflow of supplies in a humanitarian assistance disaster relief scenario. Just as with our earlier 3 examples of electricity, water, and people, it would be similarly advantageous for civil and military planners to examine the flow of goods, whether at a port, an airport, or a major distribution center, to factor into their planning considerations. Next slide, please. 5th on our list is waste. This will be covered in greater detail by Captains Geyer and Moncrief. For now, I'd like to just point out that megacities tend to consume far more than they produce, leading to waste outflows being considerably greater than waste inflows. One of the few waste items that Japan exports is plastic for recycling, yet even that number has fallen significantly due to the 2017 Chinese ban on importing recycled plastic. According to a poll of local governments conducted by the Environment Ministry of Japan late last year, much of that plastic turned up either at intermediate processing stations, where plastic is incinerated or shredded, which saw a rise of 56% over the previous year, or at final processing stations, where plastic is buried in landfills, which saw a rise of 25% over the previous year. Regardless, civil and military planners would be wise to assess what potential waste inflows a city might have and gauge how severe the outcome would be if those flows were interrupted. Next slide, please. Waste being the fifth flow that we examine as part of understanding how cities work and how best to restore them to functionality in the aftermath of a disaster, we have now examined, next, all 5 inflows to the city. With that thought in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Captain Jesse Geyer.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Captain Jesse Geyer from the Asymmetric Warfare Group, Dense Urban Terrain Team. I work out of our headquarters located at Fort Meade, Maryland, in the Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C. area. The Baltimore, D.C. area is not a megacity by common definition, but it is important to keep in mind large areas of dense urban terrain will have many similarities to operations in a megacity environment that civil and military leaders can plan and draw conclusions from. It is for this very reason that Dr. Glenn mentioned the definition of megacities that we will use here in this conference. Next slide, please. I will be presenting the same 5 categories as Major Dexter. However, I will look at how they flow within Tokyo and the greater Tokyo metropolitan area. As you can see on the screen, and from what you have just seen, there's a lot to cover. Next slide, please. Power makes just about everything in a city run. As Major Dexter explained, there are several different ways in which the city receives power, and those sources are used in one fashion or another, diverted to different parts of the city to power just about everything in it. Within the Tokyo Prefecture, there are 2 thermal power plants, the Oi and Shinagawa thermal power plants that operate off crude oil and city gas, respectively. They provide a maximum output capacity of 2.2 million kilowatts, but this is a small fraction of the total amount of power needed. According to Tokyo Metropolitan Government statistics, the 2017 total power demand for Tokyo was about 78.7 billion kilowatt hours. Therefore, those inflows of power are very important for ensuring a steady, consistent power supply for homes, transportation, and water supply, just to name a few. Next slide, please. Additionally, renewable forms of energy like hydroelectric, solar, wind, or power generation from waste allows for power to come from within a city. This is a small amount in comparison to the big power sources like fossil fuels or nuclear power that typically flow in from outside locations. However, Japan is one of the leading alternative power source consumers in the world, with aims to expand that market share in the future in an effort to reduce fossil fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. Japan is the largest importer of liquid natural gas in the world, with nearly half of its power generation coming from this source. The importance of liquid natural gas is increased due to the nuclear energy production being taken offline, then modestly brought back in recent years after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. One effort from natural gas companies in Tokyo and Japan at large is to have homes use the Enifarm system, which can provide power from liquid natural gas, but also use the heat waste from the energy conversion process to heat water. Homes with the Enifarm system are disconnected from traditional electricity and instead powered by gas that comes from city gas lines. Next slide, please. As with most megacities and dense urban environments, many types of key infrastructure go subterranean to maximize limited ground level space, and power is no different. TEPCO, which is one of Tokyo's largest electricity providers, has 199 underground substations, and more than 90% of their transmission lines are underground in the 23 wards. An added benefit is that utility infrastructure that is buried tends to survive natural disasters better than above-ground infrastructure. As a planner, you will want to know what the critical power nodes and inflows are that need to be secured in your area of operations. Also, what happens when critical inflows like liquid natural gas have issues flowing around the city if critical infrastructure gets damaged? Keep these in mind for our discussion this afternoon and for the remainder of the conference. Next slide, please. The flow of electricity to a megacity is especially important because of something that came along about the same time as electrification, the high-rise building. And with this new form of construction came a challenge: how to get water to the businesses and residences of the upper floors of these structures. Most high-rises over the past 100+ years have relied on one of two simple methods to ensure water can reach their topmost floors. Either pump water to a storage tank at the top of the building by using electricity, and then let gravity deliver it to the businesses and residences below, or pump water under pressure from its origin below the street level. These may be simple methods of ensuring that upper floors of high-rise buildings have adequate water, but nevertheless, it is one that absolutely requires electricity to work properly. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government Bureau of Waterworks has this image on their English language website to explain how water goes from beneath the ground to the highest floor of any given building. Next. Of note to us are the lifter and booster pumps shown here. They are noteworthy because they are examples of a phenomenon that is seen somewhat regularly within the world's cities. A lot of the buildings are roughly 6 stories tall. A combination of factors makes this a commonality around most of the world's cities. 6 stories is roughly the maximum height of a fire engine ladder, the need for steel reinforcement for taller buildings, and as we just covered, the need for more pumps to get water to the higher floors. Next slide, please. So how does the water get from the reservoir and rivers Major Dexter showed you to the booster and lifter pumps? After water is brought in from the reservoir via the river systems, the water enters one of 11 different water purification plants. Even though we saw a flyover of the Tama River, most of Tokyo's water comes through the intake weirs of the Tone and Ara river systems. The Water Supply Operations Center can control water from the reservoirs all the way down to the distribution pipes. There is also a raw water transfer pipe that allows water to be pushed from one side of the city to the other in case of a natural disaster. Next, Tokyo has made great improvements to its water infrastructure, and they are projected to complete upgrading water pipes to all primary sites like governmental facilities, 2020 Olympic sites, primary medical facilities, and evacuation centers to earthquake-resistant pipes. These pipes proved themselves in the Kobe and Great East earthquake, having no breaks or leaks. But not every place in the city has these earthquake-resistant pipes. So, in the event water is cut off from an area, how is water then brought into the residents until that service is restored? How does time of day when a natural disaster or a crisis occurs impact water needs? We will discuss this more this afternoon. Next slide, please. Water is a critical, life-sustaining resource that is needed daily. Given the location of Tokyo as a major seaport sitting on the Tokyo Bay and the rivers that flow throughout the city, water also has the potential to cause major damage. Tokyo has a vast amount of water moving through the Tokyo metropolitan government area. Mega rivers include, next please, the Tama, Sumida, Ara, and Edo rivers, and there are over 100 small and mid-sized rivers and canals. The Tama River, which you saw a flyover of earlier, and the Ara river systems have about 40 tributaries each. There's also a tremendous amount of water that has been diverted underground through Tokyo's urbanization throughout the years. The Edo and Ara river systems pose the highest and largest flooding danger in the Tokyo metropolitan government area, as you can see from the flood danger map on the bottom left. The heart of Tokyo sits right in the Tokyo Bay, and all this water has huge flooding potential during rainfall seasons, typhoons, and tsunami activity. As you can see in the picture, a majority of the 23 wards are at risk for flooding and storm surge in some of the more densely populated areas of Tokyo. Large amounts of groundwater and natural gas were pumped up for factory use between the 1900s and 1960s in the east area of Tokyo that caused rapid ground settlement, as much as 4.5 meters in the worst areas. Currently, 60% of Tokyo's ward area sits in a flood hazard plain with about 4.5 million residents in those areas. 20% of that area and about 3 million of those residents reside below the high water level. The residents and officials are fully aware of these hazards, and the Tokyo Metropolitan Government has developed some impressive infrastructure to help prevent the flooding. Next slide, please. Around the Tokyo Bay, you might have seen these flood prevention gates. They can be closed to prevent tidal flooding surges from typhoons or tsunamis from earthquakes. And should the power go out, they can even be closed manually. Additionally, these facilities are equipped with pumping stations that pump the rising water from the rivers out into the bay when these floodgates are shut. These pumping stations prevent flooding in the channels behind the floodgates due to river runoff during heavy rainfall. Other shoreline works like seawalls, interior embankments, and levees have been placed around the bay and up the rivers to help further prevent flood prevention. Next slide, please. Development of the Konda River Ring Road No. 7 underground multi-basin regulating reservoir has proven itself a valuable system in diverting flood waters. This system has been used 42 times since its inception. As river water levels begin to rise, the intakes to the basin are opened to divert water into the underground basin to prevent flooding. Once river levels return to normal, the water in the basin is then pumped back up into the river. Next, please. This value was proven in the tale of two similar typhoons. In 1993, Typhoon number 11 flooded 85 hectares of land and inundated over 3,000 homes. Vice just 4 hectares of flooding and 46 houses inundated from Typhoon number 22 in 2004 after the first part of the project was complete. Another measurement of its value is that the construction of the basin is 7 times cheaper than the damage caused by the number 11 typhoon in 1993, proving the old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Next slide, please. It is able to handle overflow from 5 different rivers in the Tokyo metropolitan government area. It has a storage capacity of 14.3 million cubic meters. It is 13.1 kilometers in length, 12.5 meters in diameter, and 40 meters deep underground. To give you a visual reference on the size of this project, that's Major Dexter standing on the right side in the basin tunnel. Next slide, please. Before we look at the flow of people within the Tokyo megacity, let's take a look at their collective character. The population is key terrain for operations in a dense urban environment. Decisions made by government officials and military leaders can have positive or negative effects on the human populace, which can greatly reduce or amplify the challenges on the ground during humanitarian assistance disaster relief response. It is important to understand the population demographics, culture, and subcultures, as well as the flows of the population in a dense urban area in order to execute a better disaster response effort. The demographics and social norms of a population can greatly impact the strategic through tactical level decisions that civil and military leaders need to make. Tokyo has a population of 9.2 million in the 23 wards, 13.8 once we include the Tama area, and 37.4 million, well 38 plus now, in the megacity of Tokyo. The majority of the population, about 68%, is of working age 15 to 64. A little over 20% are of age 65 and above, but this percentage is projected to rise as Tokyo faces the highest graying population of any city in the world, coupled with a low fertility rate. A Tokyo metropolitan government study predicted the peak population of the city is just around the corner in 2020, but by 2100, the total population will decline by 61%. By that time, it is predicted that 3.27 million of the 7.13 million residents will be 65 years or older. That's nearly half of the population. Think about the effects that will play on a humanitarian assistance disaster relief effort in coming years. Next slide, please. The time of day, day of the week, and holidays have some major implications to population density in a given area of the city. This is the Roppongi area during a weekday holiday. Just the day before, the vehicle and pedestrian traffic was packed both during day and nighttime hours. Next slide, please. As Major Dexter stated, the Tokyo metropolitan government area's population surges by 2.4 million people moving from outside the city core on a typical workday. But there are major movements of people from one ward to another as well. Numbers from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government show that the night and daytime difference in the 3 central wards of Chiyoda, Churo, and Minato changes by over 6-fold, going from 375,000 at night to around 2.31 million during the day. This has huge implications on response efforts to a disaster and the amount of people potentially needing to be rescued in an area. Think about all of the elevators in the buildings in those 3 wards. It is reasonable to assume that almost all are filled with people stuck if their buildings lose power. Those are all now recovery efforts, especially during peak usage times. This is just one small piece of the complexity in that terrain. Next slide, please. One of Tokyo's primary movers of this human flow of expertise and labor is its rail systems. Tokyo has the busiest metro and rail system in the world, and most of it is all underground. According to a Japan Times article, nearly 9 million passengers transit the subway each day. The Tokyo Metro has nearly 300 stations and has one of the most notorious rush hours in the world. Trains often run at 150 to 200% of their designed maximum capacity limits during these rush hour times. In a natural disaster emergency situation, that is a huge volume of subterranean recovery efforts. Additionally, it speaks to the number of people that utilize this form of transportation to go to and from work areas. Next slide, please. What you are seeing on the screen now is a sped-up version of a drive in the Yamato Tunnel along the C2 route that covered 18 kilometers and 11 minutes of completely subterranean driving about 30 meters underground on a heavily trafficked highway in Tokyo. This is one of the longest underground highways in the world. One of the things you might have noticed around Tokyo, for those not from Japan, is that most of the highways and interstates are either elevated or in tunnels underground, whereas normal city streets are the primary ground-level roadways. Next slide, please. A city has a natural flow of goods that move around through various distribution methods, some of which I've touched on a little. As items arrive at the airports and seaports, they are then pushed out into the city by truck, or in the case of fuels, water, and some industrial materials, by pipeline. Military planners also need to be aware of major distribution centers that exist in their areas of operation. An example of this is from the United States is Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix has a very large warehouse and distribution center, as well as fuel storage tank area on the west side of its city. It is one of the major distribution hubs for the southwest region of the United States of food, commercial goods, and fuel. If a natural disaster were to happen in Phoenix, the entire region would feel the effects due to the reduction of goods and supplies. If the flow is disrupted, especially the inflow to the airports, seaports, and major distribution centers, then how will the flow of goods be shifted to bring in food and survival needs? Next slide, please. Military and civilian planners would be wise to identify and secure roadways for goods and supplies to be rerouted from other areas outside of their disaster area. Tokyo has planned for this and has a network of roads already identified for use by emergency officials in the event of a natural disaster. There are even laws and public-private partnerships in place to expedite the clearing of abandoned vehicles and debris from these predetermined routes. Next slide, please. Resources and services don't come from just the commercial sector, but also from national, state or prefecture, and governments as well. Tokyo Metropolitan Government has done a great job of making its citizens aware of where disaster areas are by type and locations most likely affected. Each ward has disaster preparedness maps that show what potential hazards are present across the area. Next, please. There is even an interactive online version. These maps identify evacuation routes, emergency water points, and local evacuation centers that can safeguard people without having to conduct mass evacuations of neighborhoods or large sections of wards. These evacuation centers typically have 3 days of supplies on hand. The other outlined colored areas on the map represent different hazards by type and location. These investments in near real-time disaster updates go a long way in a coordinated disaster response effort. Accurate information is key during humanitarian assistance disaster relief operations. However, if cell phone networks are damaged and/or power goes out, how is the information being pushed to citizens in areas who normally rely on situational updates by internet, cell phone, and TV? We'll talk about more about this afternoon. Next slide, please. With Tokyo being the biggest megacity in the world, it probably doesn't come as much surprise that Tokyo is the richest city in the world by gross domestic product. Additionally, Japan is currently third in the world by this same metric. Japan also ranks third on the Fortune Global 500 list, having 52 companies represented, most of which are located here in Tokyo. Rightfully so, the immediate concern will be on saving lives and rescue operations should a disaster occur. However, with the financial powerhouse that Tokyo is, there are strategic effects to the global markets based on the financial district's ability to resume commerce and trade in a timely fashion. Next slide, please. Waste does move within the city from residential and industrial locations to waste facilities within each ward, but we'll consider that process an outflow process for the purpose of this presentation and discussion. I will discuss the fact that there are systems in place to deal with the waste that does move around the city to its outflow destinations. Garbage and recycle collection vehicles keep trash from piling up. These are key systems that prevent the attraction of rodents and insects that carry disease. In a protracted disaster situation, there's an increased risk for disease introduction to the population due to breakdown in normal flows of waste movement. Next slide. And with that, I will be followed by Captain Jenny L. Moncrief to discuss the outflows of our 5 topic areas.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Captain Jenny L. Moncrief. I'm with the Dense Urban Terrain Detachment with the Asymmetric Warfare Group. I'll be covering the flows out of the city, as did Major Dexter and Captain Geyer before me. This afternoon, I'll talk about the near and long-term security implications of the flows using the same terms. What goes in must go out, perhaps in a changed state, but out nonetheless. Next slide. Let us begin with power. As discussed by my colleagues, the type of energy sources used to generate electricity are, build slide, renewable energy, non-renewable energy, including nuclear power. Slide. Renewable energy sources are infinite or naturally replenished in a short period and have little to no negative impact in terms of output, contamination, or pollution. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government integrates renewable energy into support systems within the city with the aim of reducing overall pollution, noise, and increasing efficiency. Slide. Both nuclear power and fossil fuels may be considered non-renewable energy. The output of the non-renewable energy sources have the potential to create a rather large negative impact. Slide. In fact, fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, along with the combustion of small-scale biomass like coal or crops, are the dominant source of pollution from fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. Tokyo relies heavily on coal imports to supply the thermal power plants with which they generate electricity. Slide. Coal is also used by the steel industry. Exposure to gases emitted from these processes may have long-term negative effects. Tokyo has taken strict measures to reduce the emissions from thermal power plants, which dramatically reduce particulate matter pollution by using clean coal technology and by increasing the power generation efficiency of coal with the use of fuel cell, gas turbines, and steam turbines. The megacity of Tokyo imports raw materials like fossil fuels and transports them by road and rail throughout Japan. Slide, please. The gas utility industry law assigns districts to and obligates gas providers to safely deliver gas from the point of supply to the point of use. The Tokyo Gas Group supplies the Kanto region, slide, which extends in a 200-kilometer radius around Tokyo. The Kanto region accounts for about 40% of Japan's gross domestic product and is the country's largest area of concentrated energy demand. Slide. Several gas pipelines emanate from Tokyo Bay throughout the Kanto region. For example, slide, the Tokyo Gas Group's 49-mile Chiba-Kashima line supplies gas to industrial customers in the Kashima Waterfront Industrial Zone in the Ibaraki Prefecture. In summary, power outflows of Tokyo City include the raw materials transported from the ships in Tokyo Bay, the liquid natural gas propelled through the pipelines, and the pollution expelled or offset by the electrification process. Next slide, please. Let us transition to water. Build. Major Dexter demonstrated that the area of interest in terms of water sources feeding Tokyo extends far beyond the megacity. He also showed that Tokyo requires a lot of water on a daily basis. Slide. Captain Geyer shows how the city circulates clean water, deals with flooding, storm surges, and tsunamis. For water outputs, I will cover how the city deals with used water, and we will consider the impact if those systems fail. Next slide. I'd like to quickly distinguish between Tokyo's Bureau of Waterworks and the Bureau of Sewerage. Slide. Waterworks provides clean water to the citizens by collecting, purifying, storing, and delivering the water. Slide. The Bureau of Sewerage takes care of used, unclean, or contaminated water. Sewage here refers both to the waste from homes and factories as well as stormwater. The Bureau of Sewerage cleans the water discharged from homes and factories. It prevents flooding from rain and stormwater. Then it claims and purifies the wastewater before it is reintroduced into public bodies of water. It is important to understand the sewage system because a breakdown in any part of the process could seriously impact our civil military aid efforts. Slide. Simply stated, backed up sewage leads to unsanitary conditions which may then cultivate diseases. So how does the Bureau of Sewerage prevent this? Slide, please. Sewage is made up of 3 facilities: sewers, pumping stations, and water reclamation centers. The sewers collect and carry sewage to the water reclamation centers. The vast network of sewers in Tokyo may be compared to veins in a leaf. This network is vital to maintaining the clean appearance for which Tokyo is well known. Beneath the surface, sewers are gently sloped downwards to allow gravity to do most of the work and move the sewage. Intermittently, the pipes are too deep to be cost-effective, and the wastewater sewage must be pumped closer to the surface using pumping stations. This allows gravity to then continue the movement of the waste. Once the sewage reaches the water reclamation center, 2 things will occur. The water reclamation center will treat the wastewater until it is pure enough to be expelled into the sea, and it will dispose of or incinerate the sludge byproduct to produce an ash, which is then reused in concrete. Slide, please. The human tide of expertise and labor. Major Dexter described the daily surge of people as they travel into Tokyo. Again, what comes in must come out. However, the migrant professionals within the city don't all depart at once, so the evening's rush hour is not nearly as intense as the morning's rush hour. But with millions of commuters, not bad is a relative term. Patterns of life should definitely be a major consideration during planning. What happens when the human tide stops? What happens when ports, airports, and other main routes are no longer functioning? Slide, please. The Port of Tokyo is a major distribution hub in Japan, which supports 40 million people and much of the industrial activity in the Tokyo metropolitan area. The port's sea, air, and land distribution terminals connect to Japan's major cities via airports, railroads, and major highways, providing pathways for both imports and exports. Routine domestic routes link the Port of Tokyo with the islands of Hokkaido, Shikoku, Kyushu, and Okinawa. In the year 2009, domestic trade included 31.7 million tons of cargo. Outbound flows of domestic cargo include cars, waste soil, and heavy oil. In 2009, the Port of Tokyo hosted over 28,000 vessels, transporting more than 72 million tons of cargo, of which 40.7 million tons of cargo were for foreign trade. The foreign exports were dominated by chemical industry products, reusable materials, industrial machinery, and auto parts. Other exports included scrap metal, electrical equipment, rubber, and metal products. The port includes more than 20 cargo terminals and 5 passenger terminals that host cruise ships and other passenger vessels. The largest passenger terminal, Harumi Terminal, has 2 berths, 456 meters long by 10 meters, that can accommodate vessels weighing up to 20,000 gross tons. Next slide, please. Earlier, I mentioned that pollution was a major outflow of power, mostly from the combustion of coal. Japan struggled with air quality from the 1940s when soot and sulfur oxide were the norm up to the early 2000s. Tokyo led the path to clean air starting in 1949 when Tokyo instituted an ordinance to control factory emissions, soot, and smoke. Enhancements in the manufacturing industry and tightened emission quality standards reduced pollutants to the levels we see here today. While Tokyo's air is no longer a major outflow, it may be in other megacities. For instance, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are home to some of the cities with the most polluted air in the world. Civil and military planners should consider the effects that diminished air quality and limited visibility may have on the populace, on the city's flows like ground and air traffic, and the impact on civil and military relief operations. Next slide, please. We've discussed waste as outflows in the other areas. Let's focus on solid waste, trash, or garbage. Tokyo streamlines waste reduction in 3 stages: collection, intermediate processing, including incineration and pulverization, and landfills. In 2014, Tokyo produced 2.7 million tons of waste, of which 1/8 became landfill on Tokyo Bay, and the rest was incinerated. Tokyo has 23 incineration plants, 1 per ward. The Shinagawa plant alone can incinerate 600 tons, or 1.2 million pounds of waste per day, which is about average for incinerators in Tokyo. That's a planning factor for the amount of waste produced by 600,000 people per day at 2 pounds per person. This is during normal operations. Imagine the aggregation of waste if operations ceased for a week. Then consider the second and third order effects. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the morning portion of our brief. I know you're happy to hear that. It's 12:30 plus. There will be 30 minutes allotted for questions when we resume in the afternoon. Please be seated here no later than 13:30. There's several... 13:40. We're getting our 10 minutes back. There will be several people available to escort you to the dining facilities, including Mr. Christopher in the back right, Dr. Glenn, the AWG team, and the designated escorts. Please feel free to depart. Thank you again.
One moment, please. We have an announcement regarding the headsets.